Thank you for joining us this morning to Behind the Ballot, a voters educational webinar with Secretary of State Steve Hobbs. Um, we'll be discussing issues facing Washington voters as we head into this important 2026 election cycle. Uh, I think we have everybody here. We do ask that you remain muted. Um, we'll have a Q&A portion after Secretary Hobbs' presentation at the end. So if you have any questions, please put them in chat and we'll address those questions in order as we get to the end of that. Again, welcome everyone and welcome Secretary Hobbs. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah. Okay, you can hear me okay, I assume.
Just fine.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the best camera. Um, but that's it's government.
You're
So
doing fine.
it's lowest bidder. Um, hey, just asking Derek how I know you want me to do you said you wanted me to do a Q&A, so how much time do you want me to take on
Um,
the discussion portion of it?
I think if you leave about 15 minutes or so for Q&A, that should be okay.
Okay.
So we had about an hour slated for this. So,
Oh, great.
yep.
Okay. Well, I'll try. I'm a politician, so I'll try not to go too long. You can wave at me or something if I go too long. Hey, thank you all for being here. I love talking to people about elections. Obviously, that's what my office does. But we also have charities, corporations, nonprofits, libraries, archives. We do trade missions. There's a lot of stuff that we do, not just elections. And most of my employees are not dedicated to elections. Oop,
Oh,
someone's mic's
there
on.
we go.
Um, so I just want you to know that elections is the thing that keeps me up at night. It gives me the most stress and headaches, but it is strangely what I love. It's the great Venn diagram of politics because I did come from the state senate and security issues, national security issues because I did come from the military. I'm still serving in the military. I did a stint at the National Security Agency for a while, so very familiar with the threats out there. And so when I took office in November 21, from Kim Wyman, and just having a back brief from her, I knew what I was getting into. So we had a segment of the population that just did not believe in our elections because of the first Trump administration and the call that elections were fraudulent. That's why he lost. That's what he says. That's not true, obviously. We have the rise of nation state actors who are deliberately trying to attack server systems and the internet of elections. And it's not just presidential. I mean, they go all the way down to city council. And this is on top of the cybersecurity, is influencing operations through mis and disinformation through social media. So you have that element. So it is very complicated environment that we operate in, and I say we as election officials, not just me, but all the secretaries of state across the United States and the 39 county election offices that administer the elections at the county level. And it was fortunate that when I took over, Kim did set up a cybersecurity cell, but it was not robust enough. We had to expand upon it because of the larger threat that's out there with their nation state actors. Their capacity had gotten larger. And the other thing that Kim didn't have that she warned me about is she did not have the ability to push back on mis and disinformation. And so I created a team, a department focused on combating that. And the best way to combat mis and disinformation is just just telling the truth, just talking about elections. Actually, we've done a very good job of reminding you all when to vote, but we have done a horrible job of telling you the process of elections. And so now we have to do that because we've taken that for granted, which is why you have a segment of the population that just doesn't believe our elections are secure. And then within a few short weeks of getting into office, I had my first crisis, which was a mis and disinformation campaign directed at something called an Albert sensor. Think of this sensor as a detection device. It just tells you when a bad actor is trying to access your server, right? These are attached to servers. Every county is supposed to have one, and it tells you it kind of flags an IP address that data is coming from or to. And this misinformation campaign was basically saying that these servers are tied to George Soros. They read metadata, they change elections. None of that is true. And so I had to convene a team to get the word out that, hey, these detection devices are part of the layered defense of cybersecurity. Kim Wyman was actually on that little meeting that I had. It was a Zoom meeting, invited all the county auditors and county commissioners. She was there, Homeland Security was there, FBI was there. Our cybersecurity commander and the Air National Guard, who we team up with, was there as well. And unfortunately, that still didn't work because 3 of the counties removed their sensors based upon that lie. And what happened was a couple of weeks later, I was notified by U.S. Cyber Command. That's the military command structure that notifies or that protects the United States from cyber attacks. And anyway, they notified me that they had identified 6 Russian IP addresses that state and local governments were transmitting data to. So that basically means that somehow the Russians were able to infiltrate on some government server, and to pull information back to Russia. And so we had to get the word out, hey, these are the 6 IP addresses, make sure you're not transmitting data to. And that still didn't work with these 3 counties. And so I had to push bills basically saying, hey, we'll give you money, because counties are always hurting for money, their county auditors, if you have these sensors on. And then we had to go from carrots to sticks, which is you will have it, otherwise we're just going to sue you. So that's what we've been trying to do, just getting ahead of this. Constant threat out there from the cyber actors out there. We had Clark County get taken out for 100 hours. We had another county taken out just recently, a couple weeks ago. And so we're always trying to get ahead of the game. And then new stuff happens. You all might remember the white powder incident where someone mailed white powder to one of our election offices. And so we had to react to that. You might have heard about the ballot boxes being blown up in Clark County, right? That happened. And a explosive device, both in Clark County and Washington, and then the county just across the river in Oregon, they both got hit. And so we're constantly trying to do whatever we can to get ahead of it. We have had a great partnership with our federal partners, but unfortunately, since Trump took office, that partnership has eroded. They have restricted resources. They have taken a step back. And so states have to come together, and we have closer ties with the private sector. Thank goodness we have Microsoft right here in our backyard, so that we can kind of shore up our defenses with this emerging threat that is happening out there. And so whenever we can, we try to tell people about the elections process, because as you know, that's what people focus on when they have a false narrative or some obscure story. I'm sure you heard, like, non-citizens vote and change elections. Simply not true. That is simply not true. That there needs to be more auditing. I'm telling you, we have audits before and after the elections. It happens in every county. We check every signature. Our databases talk to other databases. We actually know when people die and pass away. So you might recall there was an election, a lands commissioner race in 24, and that race in the primary was determined by just 51 votes. because it was that close. We had to do a hand recount. And what was interesting about that race is because we had to do a deep dive, we had to do, got to look at every vote. We found 86 people had died and their ballots came in. Now, some of you are thinking, "Oh my God, dead people voted." No, that's not the case. What happened was is these people, they voted, they signed their ballots, they put it in the drop box or mailed it, and then they passed away. That's how that's how accurate we track these things. Um, so that tells you two things. One, the system works, right? So we know when people pass away. We do get ballots that come in of we they died before before the ballot came in, which means what? It means that somebody signed for their ballot, which 9 times out of 10, it's very rare when it happens, 9 times out of 10, it is a loved one sign out of bereavement signing for their spouse. That usually happens. And um, it's sad. And they get brought in to the county prosecutor's office. Typically, they're not charged because they have an affected election, and they're probably never going to do it again, right? But there have been instances where people have been charged. Just to let you know that we've caught people that have voted in the same election twice. All right, we've seen that. Typically, college students. We had an incident in Whatcom County where a young lady went to the University of Colorado, voted there because the registration drives they had at college campuses. And then, of course, mail-in ballot, right? Washington State. She voted in Washington State. She was brought in for questioning, and she told the prosecutors, "Oh, I only voted for the federal people in Colorado, and I voted for the locals in Whatcom County. You can't do that. That's still illegal. It's a Class C felony." But with her, again, um, we didn't prosecute her, or that was the choice made by the county prosecutor because she didn't have the intent. She didn't affect any elections. And I guarantee she's never going to do it again. Right. But like I said before, there have been people that have been prosecuted. And in this database system, this database sharing that we have, which is done through a system called ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, communicates with different states, communicates to the federal database, and that's how we find these things. We also communicate directly with states and do database sharing there when there are certain states that are not ERIC states. Now, I will, before I open this to questions, I'm going to tell you currently what we're dealing with. I'm sure you've heard the news. Obviously, there's a piece of legislation sitting in Congress that the president would like to pass, which is ensuring that everybody has ID, shows ID when they vote. In some cases, there's some versions of that bill. It's like getting rid of all vote by mail, which would be detrimental to this state, obviously. There's a court case currently in the U.S. Supreme Court that says that your ballot must arrive in the election center on the day of the election. So in our state, as you know, hey, as long as you vote before the postmark, before 8 p.m. on Tuesday, your vote counts. So we will get roughly 250,000 votes that come in after election day, but all of these have been postmarked before, so they're all valid, and then we count them. If they're a day after, they're not counted. Okay. But this Supreme Court case might blow all of that up. And so that will put that's a culture change, and that will put probably a lot of ballots, make them invalid. But we're trying to get the word out now that people need to mail early, like as soon as they get it, just mail it. And certainly if they're within a week or two of the election, just put it in a drop box. And most people are using drop boxes now. All right. So in some cases, like mid 70s, 70% just people using Dropbox. So people are doing that a lot. The other thing that came out is through the executive orders that you've been tracking in the news. And the latest one is having the U.S. Postal Service only mail ballots to an approved list of people. So the U.S. Postal Service reacted. They did a rulemaking, is in a 30-day public comment period right now, and we are prepared to sue them and we're suing this executive order. But basically, this rule says we give them a list of approved people, and then they're supposed to mail it out to the right person, and we're supposed to have a return envelope. Your return ballot envelope is supposed to have a barcode on it, right? So that means we have to redesign the envelope. It has to have a barcode on it. And then again, they have to be on their approved list. Well, we have a lot of questions like, well, how long are you going to hold on to this mail? You going to update it all the time? How secure is your system? Because you just said they can do this. So what's the security? And we are very concerned about what they're about to do if they actually go through with the rule. Remember, it's a public comment period, so they may not go through with the rule, but we are prepared for the worst, hope for the best. That's kind of unfortunately how we have been doing things here in my office because of what is happening with the Trump administration. And of course, on top of all that, we have to be prepared for nation state actors to attack through cyber and through mis and disinformation. So, with that, I will open up to questions, and I want everyone to know, hey, we're winning, okay? Because I saw some concerned looks on your faces out there. Just look at your screens. We're winning. Things are going great, but I am also always worried. It's fortunate that we have a lot of the states who have banded together, and we're just helping each other out in this particular time period.
Let's see, we just had a question pop in. How do we submit our comments to the USPS about their possible policy change?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I've been doing, obviously we do it through my attorneys. I don't have that answer, which is sad. So I'll have to get a hold of you, Derek, and you can put the word out. Also, just you can Google it as well. But thank you for that because more comments would be very helpful. Just flood them with comments.
Great, great. Um, is it, let's see. Are the ballots mailed out to all registered voters by counties?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, they handle it at the county level.
Okay. With this new USPS ruling, um, you mentioned that they want a list of everyone that's mailed to. They have barcodes for the return envelopes going back. Is there any concerns about those envelopes being put in drop boxes, and how is UPS going to handle
Actually, it's
not seeing
okay if you
returns?
put it in a Dropbox.
Okay.
Probably be better if you put it in Dropbox, right?
Right.
So that's what I recommend. And also what I didn't talk about, which you might know about, is we are fighting the Department of Justice. It's an ongoing lawsuit. They want all the voter data, but they want all the private information that we hold back, right? So like driver's license, full birth date, phone number, email address. We are not giving to them, and that's why they're suing the office. So far, there have been 6 cases with other states, and they have been dismissed every single time. So we're waiting for our turn at court.
Great. Lee, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry about that. I apologize. I was late coming on, so you might have already answered this question. But if they're trying to say only US citizens can vote, how are they going to verify that?
So you're talking about the USPS list, right?
I'm talking about, yeah, well, any of it.
Any list?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, let's go with current. Current situation is, you register to vote. we talked all these different databases. And remember, you have to attest that you're a U.S. citizen the moment you register. You also attest every time you sign the ballot, right? If you read the words in there, you're attesting that you're a U.S. citizen on penalty of a Class C penalty. Um, if you're a non-citizen, you vote. By the way, if you're a non-citizen and you're registered to vote, that is not illegal, okay? Because sometimes that accidentally happens. What is illegal is when they actually vote, and that's where people get deported or sent to prison. Now, what the U.S. government would like to do is they would like to take their list and bounce it off their it's called the SAFE database, SAFE system, and then off of that, they'll determine whether or not this person is a non-citizen or not. And like, I mean, we can only guess what they'll do with the information, but I can just tell you in Texas, they actually went after these people. And in some cases, it was a mistake because the system is not perfect. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm not handing the data over to them.
Great. Thank you. Nancy asks, how did you find out that the young woman had voted twice?
Yeah, so it's through Eric. So what happens is after the elections are done, we get notified. It flags like, hey, this person voted here in Colorado and here in Washington State. You should look into it, and that's how we find out about it. And by the way, I'm going to tell you, before I was Secretary of State, I had no idea we had this system, and I'm guessing a lot of you all didn't even know we had this system. And that's the point that I'm making, why we have to tell people about elections. Because I think if more people knew about that, maybe we wouldn't have had all these election deniers out there because they didn't know. I mean, we're all human beings, right? So if I'm going off my base of knowledge that I have now and someone tells me something and I have nothing to bounce it off of, then we kind of take it as fact, unfortunately. And that's why I'm trying to change that by telling people about the elections process. And we're doing that through public information campaigns, me talking to you and other groups that we're working with to spread the word.
Great. Aruna asks, when do federal acts or executive orders supersede state election laws?
So they don't because the U.S. Constitution clearly states that states control our elections. So really, the president has no authority over it. Now, Congress can jump in and pass laws, and they have done through our 250 years of existence. But executive orders, they don't. Which is why states have won and defeated about every executive order that the president has done to go after elections.
Great. Let's see. Jan asks, are you allowed to tell us which 3 counties uninstalled Albert sensors?
So let's see. I think it's Ferry, Lincoln, and then another one I can't remember. But they now have the Albert sensor or some kind of detection device. So I just want you to all know that. So that problem has been solved. Unfortunately, it took a threat of a lawsuit and some other things, but it's back on.
Great. David asked, do you work with the Democrat Association of Secretary of States?
I work with the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State, though that's more of a political arm. But I work very closely with the National Association of Secretaries of State, where I will be the president come July, which a lot more work for me. So I don't know if that was a smart move on my part.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Walt.
Yes, good morning, Secretary. One of the things the Trump administration wanted to do was eliminate mail-in voting, and we're the second state to do this. And it's, in my opinion, and a lot of others, it's worked out very, very well. It's efficient, and I represent seniors, and this is very handy for seniors, people in independent living and nursing homes and all kinds of places. And so he keeps threatening to take that away, and we can't do it. We don't have voting machines anymore. I mean, it's just, and getting all those people to the polls. So all of this now, we're coming up to the November election, which is all there. The other elections are, the primary is same as we've always done it, right? And so this, what he's proposing would affect the November election. So what is the cutoff points of no return for the problems that he's proposing that makes it too late for ballots? Or you can say, hey, buddy, you're too damn late. We're doing it the way we want to do it. Or what's the cutoffs here time-wise for a big drama?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's kind of subjective because there's something called the Purcell principle, in which case the Supreme, and most of the time the Supreme Court will go like, hey, it's too late. We can't take an effect now, but next election. Already, with this current court case, which is called Watson versus the RNC, on dealing with same day the ballots coming in on election day in the election center. They've already said it'll be for the general election, not for the primary, because the primary for some states have already happened, and our primary is really soon. But what is interesting is because the administration and those advocates that want to get rid of vote by mail, they know how difficult it is to get rid of it because we have a constitutional right to do it, is they're doing nefarious ways to get at it, right? So like trying to change the rules in USPS or put in very onerous regulations on vote by mail. For example, there is the bill that's in Congress says that you have to have a copy of your ID because if you're a vote by mail state, a copy of your ID has got to go into the ballot when you mail it. Well, I don't know about you, but my 85-year-old mom, she does not have a copy machine, right? And most seniors don't have a copy machine. Most people don't have a copy machine. My sons don't have a copy machine. So how are they going to do that? And okay, so if you're in an urban area, well, maybe you can go to the local library, you can go to Office Max or whatever and get it done. Extremely onerous, obviously. But if you're in a rural community, how are you going to do that? You're going to drive 45 minutes to go get a copy of your ID and shove it into the ballot. So these are the things that are that they know the people that are advocating for this, they know that this will upset and dismantle vote by mail. And that's why we're trying to resist it as much as possible.
So right now the ballots will be going out for the November election, the early October, right? So then the ballots are prepared in September. So that's a short window for the work to prepare the ballots, even though the ballots, their time that they're out there. So we don't have a big window left.
No, we don't. No, we don't. You're absolutely right. And we're constantly meeting with the county auditors, and our team's meeting, and we're meeting with our attorneys. And so, yeah, it's not great. It's not great.
So I've advocated for a big statewide map of drop boxes because, we got a lot of people that are like, even with a drop box, they're 30, 40 miles from a drop box. And sometimes the county auditors say, well, it takes like 14 days for the post office to get the mail when it's sent to get it to the auditor's office. So the post office is going to be a big role, but they're unreliable on the whole thing. So drop boxes could be pretty important.
Yeah, we've in fact, those of you who are listening, and then please tell your friends, get with your county auditor to find out, the location of your drop box, or your friend that may not be as politically astute as you are. Let them know where their drop box is. Drop boxes are going to be a key player in this election. I mean, they always have been, but more so this time because of what's going on with the USPS.
Well, thank you for your answers.
Thank you,
Thank
Walt.
you.
And for everyone's information, when we do publish our list of endorsements for both the primary and the general, we often include a link in there to search Dropbox locations in your area from the
On the
Secretary of
voter's
State's
card.
website. Teresa, you have a question.
Sorry, I was typing you something. I just wanted to, I've got actually two, if that's okay, because you just talked about the ID. I know that you get information from Department of Licensing. And they require ID to them to verify who they are. Wouldn't that qualify as ID?
It does to a point, because remember, in this state, we do allow non-citizens to get a driver's license. Now, enhanced driver's license, you do have to show proof of citizenship, which is why all enhanced driver's licenses, anyone who gets an enhanced driver's license, are automatically registered to vote.
Okay. And then my other question is, I know that voters sometimes get 2 ballots. And I think it would be great that people know that if you change your address before the election, or if you change your name, that you might get 2 ballots if ballots were out within a certain time period. And so could you address that for them?
Yes, so there is a lag time. So if you move during let's say you move when ballots go out and you get your ballot, and then you move to an apartment, but then you re-register at the new place, get another ballot. So that does happen. Also, sometimes if you do a last name change or, well, any name change, sometimes that causes that situation. Now, here's what's interesting. If you vote, sometimes if you vote twice, where you had this happened in Clark County. This is a little different from the situation of the college student in Whatcom County, because remember the ballot boxes blew up. So the ballot box blew up, so that means their ballot is gone. Or let's say you had a ballot, you filled it out early, you mailed it, and you forgot that you even did it. So you can do this, you can print out a ballot, fill it out, mail it. The first ballot will count, the second ballot will be invalidated. So they won't count the second ballot.
Thank you.
Great. Virginia asks if the USPS list erroneously were to show that a person is not eligible voter, what provisions are there that would ensure that the voter is able to participate in the election?
Well, I'm sorry, who asked that again? I'm sorry.
That was Virginia.
Oh, Virginia, great question. Yeah, that's my complaint, right? It's like they don't have an answer, which is really frustrating, which is why we need to not have this rule come out.
Great. Nancy says, I will be out of the country before my ballot is mailed. How can I vote?
Okay, so you're going to be out of the country before you get your ballot. Is that correct, Nancy? Is that what you're saying?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, so I would get with the county auditor.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes they can make arrangements for you. Well, they should. They should make arrangements for you. The other thing you could do is when you go overseas, I think they'll be able to help you out. But if you go overseas,
Yes.
you can, if you have availability to the internet, you can actually print your ballot, fill it out, sign it, and mail it.
Okay.
But you got to mail it early, right? So that's key.
Sure.
Are you talking about primary or general election?
It will be the primary this
Okay.
coming fall. Yeah.
Okay. As I look at the date here, yeah, you should probably contact your county auditor sooner rather than later.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mark asked, how would the passage of the SAVE Act affect married women who took their husband's name?
Yeah, that's the other thing that I'm angry about this 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 piece of legislation sitting in DC. Thank goodness hasn't left the Senate yet. Yeah, well, that's a problem because there's a mismatch, right? And so there is a theory out there that your vote would not count, or you would be, if you put it in early, it bounced back to you saying, "Hey, there's a discrepancy. You need to fix it." And then now you got to go through the whole process of taking the time off, going to the county courthouse, filling the proper paperwork to get this whole thing fixed. Which for most people be like, well, then forget it. I'm not voting, right? So that's the fear that I have. This is why this whole SAVE Act doesn't save anything, right? All it does is causes more problems and voter suppression.
Great. Teresa asked, where is the link to print your ballot?
So you go to votewa.gov, and that's where you can do it. The best thing to do is to contact your county auditor's office.
Great. Lee, are you at your computer? I see you have your hand up.
Okay, so 2 comments. Are we copacetic if we have an enhanced driver's license? Because I verified all my name changes, I did all of that. I was actually born in Canada, so I have like 4 different birth certificates, and I took all of that stuff in. I have the little flag on my driver's license, so I'm copacetic with all that. I don't need to go get a passport to vote, right?
No, you got an enhanced driver's license, which you gave them the proper paperwork that says I'm a U.S. citizen, even though you're born in Canada, and you're good. So my middle son, Truman, great name, huh? Great political name. Anyway, he was born in Germany because I was serving overseas.
The military.
Military, that's right. And he's got the proper paperwork, and so he has an enhanced driver's license. He can vote.
My other comment is in our voter guide in Spokane County, it has a list of the drop boxes where they're at. So
yeah, a lot of these, not every county, but most counties have pretty good what do you call those maps with the Google map that's kind of tied to it. So it's got these pins in there so you can know exactly where they're at. Not all of them have it, but some do. And again, if you don't know, just call them. They'll tell you.
Great. And Walt, you have another question.
Yes. Yesterday on Meet the Press, the president was asked about the voting in California because it takes a long time to count the votes. So he says, well, since they can't count the votes in one day, the whole thing's a fraud. And so, when you're talking about, what is it, 500 million votes there to do in one day? Is that possible? Has that ever happened? As AI, some of these, we don't get our totals for a while because everybody wants to make sure they're exactly accurate. But the fact that they can't count them on one day doesn't mean it's invalid. So what's your take on all of that?
So
I hear that same thing here.
Yeah, well, that's the one where he walked out on, right? I think that's the.
He was good. She kept pushing him on it, but his main thing was, well, it's since they can't count them in one day, it's a fraud.
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? And even with the court case with Watson versus RNC, but they're still giving exemptions to people over like military people, right? So are they saying that service members' votes don't count? Is that what President Trump's saying? Because that's what's going to happen. I mean, I'm telling you, I served overseas and I was deployed, and it takes time to get to the county courthouse. And also, Walt, you brought it up, the sheer size, the numbers of people that vote, right? look, we're a huge country. We've got a lot of people. We got 5 million registered voters in the state of Washington. Are we going to be able to count them in one day? No, that is not possible. And that is just a ridiculous comment for him to make. I think what is better is that we ensure that we count every eligible vote, that if it meets the criteria, we should count it. We should not discount somebody simply because their ballot in came in at, 7:59 p.m. And because of, maybe it's a small county, they don't have a lot of volunteers or paid volunteers basically to count these, or machines are slow, or maybe it jammed up. To have that person's vote not count is not right, especially in a democracy. So yeah, it's that's my opinion, and that's actually probably the opinion of most of my colleagues and every Secretary of State. By the way, just to tell you how strongly we all are as Secretaries of State, Watson versus RNC. Watson is Michael Watson, Republican Secretary of State of Mississippi. Okay, he's a Republican. I'm a Democrat, and we both believe that we have the right to control our own elections. And if a ballot comes in postmarked before 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, it should count, even though it comes in the next day, as long as it's postmarked right.
Okay, and it looks like I have one final question in our chat. Teresa asks, would you explain the signature verification when a ballot comes in?
Yeah, so every county has people that verify the signatures, and they got to go through a state patrol class. And what they will do is every signature is checked. So your ballot comes in, the county, they're going to have you're going to see it they'll see it on the screen, and then your signature will come up on the screen, and then they'll see if it matches. And here's something you don't know. Sometimes they'll check every signature in that household. And the reason why they do that is because sometimes we catch like a mom or dad or grandparent signing for everybody. Doesn't mean they voted for them. Typically what it is, once you get down to these things, is that, like, my kids did it. My kids fill out their ballot and forgot to sign them. Okay. And they're both, at the time, they're both going to University of Washington. They didn't sign their ballot. I told them, I said, hey, please sign your ballot. And oh, by the way, did you know your dad is the Secretary of State? So you should sign your ballot. Well, they didn't do it. So, I drove down in and had them sign it. But in some cases, in some of these households, the mom or dad goes, oh, I'll just sign for them. You don't do that because we catch you. And so it is done at that level. Now, there is some great technology out there, and I think in the future, and we're looking into it, is that AI is amazing. So what we'll have is AI will scan the signature and rapidly pull your signature from the database and match it. And then that will make things go faster. And then what we'll do is we'll add a human element, because if it doesn't match, then, or we'll pull one out of every 5, and a human being will actually look at it to make sure. Just because, trust but verify, and not everyone feels confident about, AI, and would like to have a human being involved in it. I would like to have a human being in it just to make sure the system is working. But technology is moving in that direction where AI will probably start scanning your signatures.
Okay. And this is kind of a follow-up. We know that people's signatures change over time.
Yes.
But especially for seniors, what if their signature has changed due to illnesses, arthritis, Parkinson's, issues like that?
Yeah, Derek, thanks. That does happen. Sometimes a stroke. And what happens is, if it doesn't match, you're going to get notified by the county. It's like, hey, we need you to update your signature. By the way, I urge everyone to sign up for texting. You can do that at votewa.gov. You get text messaging of where your ballot is in the process, including you get a text message of, hey, guess what? Your signature didn't count because it doesn't match, right? And then you'll have to update it. There's technology looking forward, perhaps being able to, what we call curing your ballot because the signature didn't match or you didn't sign it. The ability to sign on your phone to cure your ballot, something that we're looking at, but obviously I want to make sure that is secure and safe from cyber threat actors out there. Also, Derek, young people, their signatures get rejected because they didn't go through cursive, right? We all learned how to do cursive when we went to high school, or maybe younger than that. And I see it in my own kids, right? My oldest kid took cursive, and then between my oldest and my youngest, they stopped doing that. And the young kids out there, so you got grandkids or kids, watch them do their signature. If there's a lot of times they will just mimic what you do, right? They'll do a squiggly line and they think that's a signature. Look, you just got to be consistent. That's the key, is consistency. If you can print your name, just tell them to print their name, because we will look at their signature on their ballot and we will look at their signature on their driver's license or whatever government document. And if it matches, it's good. So just tell them to be consistent.
Okay. And Connie asks, where do we go to update to avoid any issues like this?
That would be your county auditor's office. Go contact them.
Great. And Walt, I'll let you finish up today.
Well, thank you. This has to do with people in apartment buildings or group settings, even families. So people sit around or whatever and they vote, and then they got them all there, and then they got to get them they decide they're going to go to the drop box. They could go to the mailbox, but now one person taking 4 or 5 ballots and taking them to the drop box or to the mailbox. Now there's a deal called ballot harvesting. Is it okay for me to take 4 or 5 ballots that have been sealed in the envelopes and put them in the drop box? Is that okay? And what's your comment about all
Yeah,
that?
no, absolutely, it's okay. You can do that. I do that with my family. I've seen that with I got a friend of mine whose parents are elderly. They can't really get to the drop box, so he takes them and puts them in the drop box. So that is perfectly okay, because we're going to check your signatures at the end anyway, and we'll know. So.
And drop boxes save money for the election costs, right? Because
Oh yeah, well yeah, we don't have to pay the postal fee. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, which keeps going up. I don't know what it is now, but that's a big fee. So for this, all right. Thank you for everything.
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely.
Thank you, Walt. Secretary Hobbs, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all the information you've presented to our members. We definitely appreciate it. All we can do is keep people informed.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me. Any chance I get to talk to people about elections, I love doing it. And look, if you don't trust me or you don't believe what I say, just contact your county auditor. And in fact, they love having you over. They love having observers, and give them a call. Go down there for the day. Bring a friend. I encourage you to do that. Also, spread the word, right? So when you're the 4th of July, when you're having your family together and you get that weird brother that maybe watches too much ultra right wing talk show, you can set them straight. It's like, no, that's not true, that dead people don't vote, because we've got Eric and we know when dead people vote. Hey brother, why don't you come down with me? We're going to go to the county auditor's office and check out the election. So I encourage you to do that.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming today for this. This will be archived and it'll be available on our website for future reference. So again, thank you, Secretary Hobbs. We appreciate you and appreciate you informing our members today.
Thank you very much. Take care.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Oh,
You
bye.
too.